This episode of the Media Leader podcast was edited by our production partner, Trisonic, a results-focused agency that plans and buys all audio media. Check them out at trisonic.co.uk. That's trisonic.co.uk.
85% of digital ads are not getting to the level of attention that you need to basically land a memorable impact with a consumer.
Welcome to the Media Leader podcast. I'm Jack Benjamin. Everyone is fighting over slivers of attention. In an era marked by the massive popularity of short-form video, changes in behavior around second screening, and increased but fractured media consumption, getting an edge on the competition could be the difference between someone spending 3 seconds looking at your ad as opposed to 1.5 seconds. Will Parrish is the Chief Strategy Officer at VCCP Media. Earlier this year, the agency, alongside attention expert Karen Nelson-Field and her team at Amplified Intelligence, conducted a study into how having distinctive brand assets can be a game changer for advertisers competing for those split seconds of attention on social platforms. He joined me on the show recently to unpack the key findings from the study, how they impact his understanding of the media mix, how brands should be considering attention within their wider measurement toolkit, and why it's the case that there is no longer, to borrow from Lord of the Rings, one asset to rule them all. This is our conversation. I hope you enjoy. Will Parrish, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, how did you get into the media industry? And in particular, what attracted you about being a media strategist? Because I've spoken to a lot of strategists. I don't think I've ever asked them that question in particular.
Oh, I'm sure you'd get a million different answers from a million different strategists. But I think, as is stereotypical, I kind of fell into media specifically. We were just talking about this before you pressed the big red button that I did student radio when I was at Edinburgh, and so we used to muck around with making ads. So I think in the first instance, I actually had more of a inclination to the creative side, as in the making of the ads, less about the placing of the ads. But then when I took an interview for which is where I started my career, on the Xbox account, and
that's a cool account.
It was a really great, it's the perfect blend of imagination, creativity, but also it's a big blue chip client, so you need to know your stuff. And also the account itself was twinned with McCann, so it was kind of as close as you can get to, in the modern sort of era, I suppose, an integrated creative and media relationship, because of the sort of, they were all within IPG. So what it meant was I kind of had the best of both worlds at the beginning of my career, where I was responsible for the frameworks and the consistency of media thinking across all the different markets. It was a global role for Xbox, but also you had different releases, different platforms. So Xbox One was the big account, a big launch at that time. But also you had dance games and Xbox Connect sports games and Forza racing. So there was loads of kind of opportunity to be creative. At that point, I was more doing account management, but what it got me a real flavor for was, how do different audiences work within the context of one seemingly singular area? So in that instance, gaming, you would assume there's a certain type of consumer, but actually the launch itself was pointed primarily at an entertainment proposition for the whole family. Different titles had different sort of, hardcore gamer audiences or casual gamer audiences and so on. And so as a result, you end up getting this real hunger for understanding how they operate. I think that's probably the gateway into strategy for me. I
mean, we're getting into the weeds, but I remember that launch was very controversial within the gaming industry because it felt like gamers weren't being spoken to enough. Not to criticize any of the work that you guys were doing.
Do you know you've hit the nail on the head. We had an idea called Glitch that a previous boss of mine came up with, which is kind of where, again, I kind of got a real first dip of a toe into creativity in media, I suppose. And the idea there was that we baked a glitch into the TV ad that had, I think there's 27 frames per second roughly in a TV ad, and each frame was baked with loads and loads of very gamer-specific codes and ciphers. The idea being that the ad itself was primarily an entertainment message for the whole family, so you could watch. It was the time when you could just about watch streaming shows on your console and so on. And so you're quite right about the sort of the consensus was PlayStation was positioning itself a lot more for the gamers, for the players, I think was the line, and Xbox was kind of going in that more all-in-one entertainment package. So the idea that we had with this glitch was to almost speak directly to the hardcore gamers, because we posted it in forums online, and then it became this sort of thing that they could, as a community, crack and uncover little nods to different games and stuff. So, but you're absolutely right. The prevailing wind was, is this for the gamers or not?
Well, really interesting work that you did earlier in your career.
Yes.
To the here and now, we've just come out of what seems like a massive events season. You had South by Southwest London for the first time here in the UK. MadFest just happened last week as of the recording of this episode. And of course, Cannes was just a couple weeks ago. So they're all in the rearview mirror, but there was a lot of opportunity to talk to clients, to other people in the industry, and sort of get a sense of how everyone's doing. And I'm curious from your perspective, in terms of like a temperature check, what would you say the prevailing takeaways from the past couple weeks of big industry events have been?
Yeah, and there was plenty of that conversation on the Croisette, and we were talking about this earlier in VCCP. I had a conversation with someone in Cannes where they asked a similar question: what's the sort of big theme? What's the sort of thematic that you're feeling? Whether it's before it was, there was lots of purpose chat a few years ago, and what was the equivalent this time around? And I said somewhat flippantly as a bit of a joke, but I do think it is sort of true that there's the sort of the faint whiff of fear was something that I sort of jokingly referred to as something I'd heard just below the waterline in what people were saying. And what I mean by that is, there's obviously lots of conversations about AI, and there were last year and the year before, but I think now there's just the faint edge of which parts of the current agency setup is it going to transform, which ones is it going to replace, which ones is it going to enhance. And so there's a real sense of not fear is not the right word really, but uncertainty in that regard, coupled with some of the big geopolitical sea changes at the holding companies. So there's a little bit of a concern, I think, in will those companies be a very different shape, proposition? How will they package themselves? What does that do for different people in their careers? So there's a little bit of that I noticed. And then there was also the sense that just in general in the world, things are bigger and scarier and possibly more important than how do we manage our media campaigns. And so you couple those things together, and I did get the sense that there's possibly a little bit less optimism than there has been. But that said, I then look at some of the work that's coming out from the Palais, and there's still plenty to be excited about. I love the fact that there's lots of campaigns that look at how media ecosystems work. So as an example, the Waitrose Christmas campaign, one big, I can't claim to have had anything to do with that, but I do remember at the time thinking that's a great way of viewing multi-platform media in a creative sense. So you basically build a whodunit narrative over many different platforms. Similarly, you've got the sense that you can't necessarily fight the tide of attention. There's less and less to be had. Things are more fragmented, but if you're Budweiser, you can certainly build a campaign that's 1 second long that's wholly memorable by using the hooks from music. So I do think, in spite of the change and the worry, there is always going to be people who can find a creative way to solve it. So
yeah, you mentioned attention, and we'll get onto that in a moment. I'm curious, just because you also mentioned AI, how much would you say from a strategy perspective, AI is starting to augment maybe the work that you and your teams are doing and looking at the moment?
Well, I mean, in media, I keep saying to people, I don't think AI is a particularly new concept with a full stop on the end, but it has been predominantly delivered through, the way programmatic or algorithmic buying has worked for a few years. What's exciting, as is in your question, is the way it can help us get to smarter, more interesting solutions further up the planning process or further up the sort of decision-making process for working with clients. So, for example, what we're doing at the moment in VCCP is trying to find ways to make the readily available LLM systems part of the way we work, but also complement that with some more ownable systems that we've built ourselves. In practical terms, back in the day, you would need to look at a bunch of premium third-party subscription data, whether that's YouGov or TGI or whatever it might be. You'd also need to look at client data, which is usually delivered in very different formats, sizes and shapes. You'd look at market mix modeling data, which again might come from a third party or be done internally. And then you'd have your own planning consoles and systems that you might use to formulate scenarios and so on. All these disparate sets, as a strategist or even a media planner, you'd sort of have to know how to wield them, even though they're not particularly well connected. What's really exciting with AI systems is you can train these essentially brains to read structured and unstructured data together. So you now have this opportunity to pull in all of those elements I just mentioned, plus readily available open world digital data, search data, social data, Reddit comment threads, and so on, and pull it all together and ask unified questions of it. So what's really exciting is you can go into a room with a client and say, this is an approach that we've built. These are some imaginative media executions that fall off the back of that against these audiences. And you can say with confidence, there are this many of them based on this data set. There are these insights about them based on these real world conversations, and they've all been viewed as one. And we've been able to QA it through AI. So it is quite exciting. It's a bit of a new frontier, though, to be honest. So, I mean, you may ask me this question in 6 months' time. I'll have a very different answer for you.
Well, I'm definitely happy to catch up in about 6 months' time, and I'm sure it will be a different answer. But the main topic I did want to ask you about is research that you've completed and published recently. It was conducted with Dr. Karen Nelson Field of Amplified Intelligence, who I think you referred to as the Beyonce of attention at Cannes.
Yeah, that is a phrase we used. I've also called her, or I think she called herself, or someone did, and I've just piggybacked off it, the High Priestess of Attention.
Oh, okay. Also a good one.
Yeah, that is a good one. Yeah, I mean, last year we had a sort of unofficial platform for VCCP Media, which was less beige, more Beyonce. It was the sort of belief system we had that media can be relatively beige, and it can be quite cookie cutter and samey. And so we looked at some of the work that Beyonce had done for Verizon at the Super Bowl last year and said that's the sort of media creativity, integration, smart thinking we want. And so I think based on that, the word Beyonce has been sort of unofficially attached in some way to VCCP Media. So we thought we'd just pass it on to Karen, who really does, embody that.
Definitely. And the report is titled Hacking the Attention Economy. First of all, for any of our listeners that have yet to see the report, read the report, can you just give me a top line? What were some of the key takeaways from your perspective as a strategist?
Yeah. So at the heart of the piece of work is a research experiment that we conducted where we basically had a hypothesis, which was that when you have very, very fleeting attention, so the fragmentation of media means that essentially 85% of digital ads get less than 2.5 seconds of attention, which is wholly depressing. And it would be for anybody, but it is unfortunately the reality that we're faced into based on the way that the platforms train our user behavior. So the more we scroll, the more we swipe, the more they collect data, the more that monetizes the platforms. And so as a result, just by the nature of the way that we're all being trained, our attention spans are shrinking. So lots and lots of studies have existed in that regard to test, does platform A or format A versus platform B and format B have higher or lower attention realities? So that's research has been done in quite large amounts across different studies, different platforms, different people. And similarly, lots of tests have been done about creative. Does this piece of creative yield a higher or lower amount of attention? Does the attention sustain through the ad? So those are pieces of research that have been done by different people. What nobody had done, as far as we knew up to this point, was to look at when I have a well-branded second of attention and when I have the exact same second of attention, as in the narrative of the ad is the same, but I've removed the distinctive branding, what does it do? So that's what we went to Karen with, and we said, look, this is good for us as an integrated media and creative entity in VCCP to be able to really put a numerical figure, both in terms of attention, but also business impact on what happens if you don't own that second of attention. Because if you only get 2.5 seconds, what happens? So to cut to the quick, the actual experiment that we ran was called the Bad Twin Test. So what we did was we took 8 brands that we look after at VCCP, and we found the 10-second or less digital iteration of the most recent campaign that had run. So we did it for, I'm going to forget some here, but Bulldog, Sage, Cadbury, O2, we did EasyJet, there was a few others, White Claw. And we took the ads and we had some rules, which is really important to have these rules, which have been obviously brought into question in the LinkedIn comments a lot. But I think we fought the good fight to essentially remove only the distinctive assets, which included colorways, sonics, characters, visual devices and elements. But in every instance, the ad was exactly the same in terms of the narrative, length, any voiceover, product usage, and the logo had to be in both. So regardless, it was not, you wouldn't be able to mistake it easily for a different brand.
So basically a non-distinctive version of their ad, almost blander in that way.
100%. Yeah, exactly. But with the rules in place that if you were to look at that ad and ask someone completely subjectively, was that an ad for Domino's, which was one of them, or was it someone else? It would definitely be
It wouldn't be
Domino's ad.
bootleg Domino's.
Correct.
Right.
Exactly. So with that in place, we then ran those ads through Amplified, which is the company that Karen founded. They have their testing environment that essentially mirrors people's social feeds, and allowed us to look at how long do you get attention-wise for the good and the bad twin, and then what's called STAS and MA. So STAS is short-term advertising strength, which is essentially a pre and post question that reflects a shop environment. So it basically says which of these products before you conducted the experiment would you purchase with the same price point, and we gave them a list of competitors, and then after the fact, which one would you select? So essentially it's a proxy for lower funnel, immediate purchase intent behavior. And then the other part is what's called MA, or mental availability. So that tests brand strength and how memorable the actual ad is. And that's based on a more complex set of questions that are asked pre and post. For White Claw, as an example, which of the product set that we gave as a competitor set for White Claw, which one would you choose in a party setting? Which one is a refreshing drink? To kind of create the mental associations between, in this case, White Claw and a bunch of competitors that we put forward. So with that in place, what we found was, first of all, the truth is media dictates the amount of attention that you get, not the creative, which is something that has been well established, not just by us, but by a lot of Karen's research before. Essentially, in the good and the bad twin test, you always got roughly the same decay between the two social platforms that we tested, and then the display.
Can you say which platforms those were?
I can't say which ones. I'm sure if anybody listening to this wants to follow up and have a discussion, I'm happy to share. Let's call them Platform A and Platform B. Sure. They are readily used and on most media plans. And so within the test, it basically showed that there was about 3.5 seconds of attention roughly for Platform A, about 4 seconds for Platform B, and then the display MREC format that we used had a quite a significant drop off at about 1.5 seconds. From the best performing creative to the lowest performing creative, from the well-branded originals, the disparity was about 25%. So it still shows that there's a difference. Some ads get more, some ads get less, but the variance between the platforms was about 65%.
Right.
So what it essentially tells you is you can push up to the top end of a attention corridor with good creative. You can obviously sink to the bottom with bad creative, but it's fixed by platform. If creative was the thing that performed the best in terms of what drove attention, you would expect the, let's say, 4.5 seconds of attention that the best ad on the best platform got would be the same across each of those environments, but it falls off at the same rate across the platforms. So that was finding number one. Finding number two was what happens when you do have a good branded second of attention versus not, and do you get better or worse attention levels for when the distinctive assets are in place? And the truth is you get a tiny bit. So when you get a flash of a bulldog from the bulldog ad that we showed versus removing that character and replacing it with product pack shots and logo prominence, you get about 0.5 seconds of attention more on the social platforms. You actually get slightly less on the display environments, which is just an interesting finding from the research. And so as a result of that, it also tells you that distinctive branding may give you a tiny competitive advantage in terms of the amount of attention you get, into how attention grabbing it is, but not enough to really shift the needle. So the next question, which is where the really interesting findings came from, is what happens to those STAS and MA outcomes when you have good and bad branding? And that's where the whole thing kind of came to light. So in simple terms, we had 2.5 times the return on investment as proxied by short-term advertising strength when there was good branding versus none. So essentially for a split second, when there is a distinctive asset in place, the amount of intent to purchase went through the roof to the tune of 2.5 times versus the none. So suddenly you have a brilliant line of defense, let's say, for making sure that you brand and you own your brand world in those short-term fleeting attention environments. So that was kind of the big initial aha moment. Where it got more interesting was then to look at what does that translate into from a business impact perspective. So we then looked at the original statistic of 85% of digital ads get 2.5 seconds of attention or less. Now, the really troubling part with that piece of information is 2.5 seconds was, up to that point, believed to be the threshold for when you get a memorable impression.
Right, sort of MRC standard is around 2.5 seconds of attention with other caveats. Right.
Exactly.
So most ads are not reaching that threshold.
Yeah. So 85% of digital ads are not getting to the level of attention that you need to basically land a memorable impact with a consumer. So essentially the question that we had was, when you use those distinctive assets and elements, does that affect how much memorability you can drive, and does it change the amount of attention seconds you need? And this is where Karen said something a lot less palatable language-wise than what I'll say on the
You're allowed to swear
phone.
on this podcast. I mean,
Well,
it's unregulated media.
She said it was fucking incredible, which was I was on a holiday up to Scotland at the time, so I had to pull over in a lay-by somewhere near Newcastle to take a call and check in on the information. And the reason why she was so excited about it was because what we'd found was the mental availability scores started to show in the good twins versus the bad twins from 1.5 seconds. So what that means in practical terms is, if you assume that 85% of your digital advertising was deemed to be wasted from an attention perspective up till this point, and suddenly you only need 1.5 seconds to drive that initial mental availability.
If you have good assets.
If you have good assets, exactly. Suddenly you unlock a load of wasted inventory, provided you know how to integrate the creative and the distinctive brand assets you have available into these short-term environments. So that was kind of where we got to from the nerdy side of the data. The next question was, how do you turn that into something really digestible at a boardroom level, or at least for our clients to be able to defend the power of their brand in a digital space in a more palatable pounds and pence figure. So what we did was we took the CPM costs that we had for the media buys, the equivalent media buys for each of the formats we were testing, and then we built a formula that essentially suggested how much money you would need to spend with the bad twin to get to the level of output that you would get with the good twin from the MA and the STAS responses, and then backed into it from the CPM costs. So essentially getting to how much money are you wasting when you put badly branded ads into those digital environments versus the good. And so we created what we called the asset tariff. Obviously, we use that word knowingly because there's a lot of tariffs flying around in the world. And I had initially thought it would be maybe about 20% of the spend was wasted, so the tariff is about 20 pence in the pound. And when it came back, it was kind of shocking. So it was 66 pence in the pound is the delta essentially between if you put badly branded ads into those short-term environments versus good. And that's kind of exciting because it means you can, if you're a client, you can confidently say, well, this is the value of the brand that I've built over 10, 20, 5, however many years of brand building. The impact it has in the sort of perceived unbrandable and fleeting moments in digital is suddenly you can point at and put a cost on, which is kind of exciting.
In terms of the impact on how you think of a media mix, I mean, you talked about studying certain platforms that it sounds like generally have relatively low attention times. I mean, as we all know, social platforms, as you described, you flip through over and over and you see lots of different ads, but also other different posts. Has it impacted how you consider putting media investment in different places? Do you think, wow, with this research, as long as we have a really good distinctive brand asset that we're confident with, we can advertise more confidently on these platforms, or is it working in a different way?
Well, I mean, the first thing it's done is it's opened up a whole raft of what's next questions, which I suppose we can get into. The important thing is actually the biggest question mark that has come from anybody has probably been from within VCCP in the first instance, because what you can easily misconstrue this research as being is saying now we can build everything we need for our media mix and for our brand in 1.5 seconds. So we can rely wholly on tiny fragments of attention and therefore lean into cheaper or higher volume inventory in this new digital world at the expense of longer attention format spaces and places, which gets you to, taking, I don't know, linear TV or AV off the plan in favor of just being, a 1.5 second brand. And that's 100% not what this research is saying. In fact, in a funny way, it sort of is telling us the opposite, I believe, which is the amount of time and attention and money and care that you put into the longer form, higher attention environments is what enables you to capitalize on those shorter attention environments. So Karen talks about the attention flywheel, which is basically the more you build active attention seconds into your plan and therefore into your brand, the more the fleeting, shorter attention environments where there's lots of passive actually works for you. So another way of thinking about it is everybody is essentially walking through a carousel as a customer coming into category, understanding what's available in that category, and then coming out of category. So you can't really rely on, well, we built those brand assets up, toucans for Guinness, in many years ago, or whatever it might be for your brand. Suddenly you can't just go, well, that's fine, that's done, and we can just use them now. We can weaponize them in short attention environments, and that's that. You have to be constantly thinking about build them up, which is using higher attention media to imbue them with meaning, to give them new meaning, not just the existing kind of initial ways people perceive those particular elements of a brand, and then be able to use them to greater effect in short term. So in essence, the media mix doesn't necessarily change dramatically. What does change, as far as we're concerned, is the types of assets that you use and the types of formats that you use, which I think is where we've possibly been a little asleep at the wheel.
Yeah. So if you're like a new brand, new-ish, and you're trying to grow your business significantly, and you're not necessarily distinct enough yet, actually maybe spending on the platforms, you're fighting against a 2.5% or 2.5 second attention span issue. Whereas if you'd maybe spend some time investing, really building a distinctive brand, and then coming back, maybe you have more success in terms of getting attention a little sooner.
Yeah, for sure. And then I think the same questions and rules apply. If you're building a brand, you need to be thinking about, how do I maximize presumably a lower amount to spend and a lower amount of sort of, assets to play with in the first instance, because you're a challenger or you're coming into a category. You would still need to find an audience that you can win with. You would still need to build your brand with them, and then you'd scale from there. So I think nothing changes in that regard, but what it really does is it gives you the confidence to be able to defend the value of those assets that you've built, and also be able to demonstrate what happens when you use them, because you cut through 2.5 times better when you do.
You mentioned the fact that there's essentially a ceiling and a floor when it comes to how much of an impact creative can have. And that ceiling and floor is based off of the media choice that you've made.
Yes.
How do you get creatives on side with all of this research when you've essentially told them that there's a ceiling and a floor to how important their work is? I mean, have discussions with the creative parts of the business been more challenged or more enlightened from this type of research?
Not necessarily. I think one thing I've found, especially having started working at VCP a little over a year ago, is just how open and curious our creative teams are to understanding the strengths and weaknesses of different media environments. So one thing I think that media practitioners can and should be is just a much better foil to our creative teams in just purely in explaining what the actual constraints are of different formats, when there are new formats coming in, what does that mean for your creative? The other thing is also almost helping the way that they formulate the output to just be fit for that new palette of media environment. So we're no longer in a world, and I think most people know this, that you can have the luxury of a 60-second ad that gets cut down into a million different sort of shorter forms, and that should be job done. So it's also about helping them realize that the idea for the creative needs to manifest in almost like more of a brand world rather than a specific singular narrative device. And again, I don't want to, overly just say it's just VCP doing it, but obviously my context is the work coming out from our particular agency. The recent O2 work is a fabulous example of that. So you've got the distinctive asset that's been really dramatized is just literally the O2 of O2. And the reason for that is it means oxygen. It's essential for living. So is your phone. Somewhat in a sort of somewhat ironic sort of closed loop. The fact that your phone is so essential that if you drop it by accident, your heart stops. Because it's so important for you. So O2 being essential for living, and the oxygen bubbles being an element of that, and the simple circle with a little 2 next to it. If you look at the recent ad, it's a brilliant example of, for the 60-second cinema copy, which ran, and it's very beautiful. It's about a baby's first breath, and there's lots of circular devices that appear from the light above, in the obstetrician, all the way through to the gigs they go to and the shape of the microphone. And it plays out with Sean Bean's iconic voice, has always been part of O2, about from that first breath right the way through to all the things they'll experience in life, that what an amazing life they'll lead, and how O2 will be part of that. But that same device, the circular device, is then used for the social video for roaming, and it's the wheel of a Vespa with a little 2 next to it, and then it shows how that that couple in the ad navigate the whatever Mediterranean village they're riding through. Similarly, if you look at the outdoor posters for the rugby sponsorship, you have the rose with a little 2 next to it. You have all of the different devices that they've managed to find very cleverly that represents a circle. But importantly, you look at all the social content, organic and paid, they've just brilliantly looked at all the little circles with a 2 next to it to be able to tell a myriad different set of stories. So if you get it right, you don't really have to compromise. I think you just have to understand that you're building almost with the lowest attention environments in mind, as well as the longest, which is possibly the pivot. But as far as I can see, there's been no dramatic pushback.
I mean, I'm hearing echoes of a lot of what you wrote for us in an op-ed. I think it came out in January. You argued that creativity is the new targeting, and that one asset to rule them all doesn't really work anymore. But what you've also just said is it's not the same asset, but it's a similar idea that's going throughout a wide multimedia campaign.
Yes.
I could imagine that's very difficult for a lot of brands, especially as they're trying to spend more money on social platforms, working with creators who want to take their brand and do something unique with it that works for their audience. That's a lot of the advice that I often hear, is just let the creator, give them a sandbox and let them sort of play. So what would your advice then be to make sure that there's this level of consistency across the whole plan in terms of the creativity, while also dealing with all this other advice that people might be hearing?
And you asked me a little bit on what was the theme from Madfest and Cannes, and I probably gave you quite a depressing answer about
a realistic answer, fair answer.
But one thing I did see was that there was a lot more positive noise about research and effectiveness papers at Cannes, which I was quite pleased to see. So, and it wasn't just us doing our hacking the attention economy piece. Karen had the cost of dull media, which we also got a couple of nods in, which was nice. But I was pleased to see the System 1 reports that were all about the sort of new long and short of it, short form advertising, and how does creativity and brand building work in that space. And one of the bits of data from that was all about, don't quote me on the actual data point because I haven't got it on top of my head, but was about exactly your question. So how do you own the brand narrative but give it over to creators or brand partnerships, branded content, all of these vehicles that we use to almost get more relevancy with an audience? It will come at the expense of the controllability of your message. And I suppose you could argue, well, that's where understanding those conceptual elements of your brand and what you're trying to get across are so critical. I won't, again, we were pitching for a piece of business recently where in the meeting, I showed them a piece of their own creator content. And I said, you've put, a large amount of spend behind it. You can see it on TikTok ad library. It's easy to access. And the product in question, let alone any kind of brand device or narrative, doesn't appear until second number 12. Mm-hmm. So that creator in that instance is getting shed loads of impressions supported by a brand, and the only thing that's visible is their face. So that is the next thing I think I want to really dig into, is how does the attention reality work for creators and for influencers and for branded content? Because undoubtedly there is more attention to be had with those types of outputs. The question is how much of that is being attributed to you as a brand versus them. And my hunch is not everybody is really on top of how to brief those creators. Not everybody is on top of how to really understand the brand world that they're operating on behalf of, and what that looks like in a credible way for that particular creator. And it doesn't have to be that difficult. Like, it could be that you have a consistent thematic device, or there's a product that you have that is particularly unique to you that is always prominent. I think it's going to vary case by case. It's not like there's one size fits all here. But I do see a lot of creator content where I don't think anybody's getting anything out of this apart from the creator. And we probably do need to have a slightly better steer on how does that work.
Get something in visible within 2.5 seconds or 1.5 seconds if it's a really distinct asset, or something that you can actually brief a creator and say, do whatever you need, but we need to be visible quickly.
Yeah, for sure. And the same goes for, partnerships we might do with publications or whatever. You have to tread a really smart line between the editorial credibility of that space, which is what you're buying into. So if it's, I don't know, let's say if it's Condé Nast and you want to do something in the travel space or whatever it might be, you clearly want to borrow that equity. That's 100% the reason why you're investing your client's money there. But if it's misattributable to a competitor or just the category in general, then it's not really doing the right job for you. So I do think that's where we need to do a lot more, probably research and work to quantify that misattribution, or how does it actually work when you pull brand assets in. And the really nice thing for us anyway is, when we did our initial presentation of the Hacking the Attention Economy research, loads of the platforms who we invited along to listen, they were super keen to kind of say, we'd love to do the next round with you, whether that's AV companies, different publishers. So hopefully in the not too distant future, we can follow up with a quantified view of what is currently my subjective perspective.
It's interesting because there's sort of two things at play here. One is sort of the efficiency of the media buy, and then two is the efficiency of the creative buy in terms of how you're briefing it into clients. Are these becoming equally important, or has one? I feel like media efficiencies, we talk about it a lot more at the Media Leader, more so than the creative efficiency, but are they equally important, or how do you make sure that everything's efficient across the board?
I suppose it sort of depends a little bit on the platform. But one of the things, not the last trip to the south of France, but the year before, because it was starting out relatively new in VCCP Media, we were doing a lot of meetings with different platforms and partners to help us almost validate the belief that we have that creative and media integration is absolutely critical for the next step of marketing and how you get better results for clients. It sort of anecdotally feels true to say, you can't really deliver in the fragmented media landscape good media without understanding how to flex and build the right type of creative at scale. That's one belief system. And similarly, from a creative perspective, you can't create a really great suite of assets without understanding the constraints and the opportunities of different media environments. So to that end, we met with a bunch of different platforms and partners, and the ones that we thought were the most interesting were the ones that sort of answer your question together collectively. So platforms like Smartly, for example, who we work with on a couple of different clients, they essentially offer a suite where you're uploading templated versions of creative at scale, and you're uploading audience definitions or buy types that can be put across platform, because what it allows you to do is almost let the algorithm determine the quality of the creative based on how much people are engaging with it. And then it will allow the media efficiency element, i.e. the optimization of budgets, to flow towards where that creative is best getting the right kind of resonance. Now, what I think is really smart is if you can close the loop on that and start to say, well, we can re-inform what type of creative we build next. So what's the next content shoot look like, or what's the next creative brief look like, based on the actual performance of that flow of media money towards the creative that's working best. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but... Yeah,
basically, you can become predictive with the efficiency of how creative plays and then make a more efficient media buy.
Totally, yeah, exactly.
Right. Interesting. From a client perspective, how should they be viewing attention? Because one brand marketer at your event in Cannes, I think he asked you call it a spicy question. This is a great event, by the way. I have them saying, quote, "I don't find attention very useful as a metric at all. There's a lot of talk, but there's no real measurement framework. I struggle with it generally as something we should be tracking because it's not very trackable well today." It's something that I think you hear a lot in the sort of marketer space. It's whether or not they have read all the research with regard to attention, or if they're maybe ignorant of some things, is completely irrelevant. It's whether or not they believe it. There's a perception issue, perhaps. What would you say to those types of people?
Yeah, and you'll be surprised to say that I definitely remember that question. It was definitely one that was remarked on afterwards, and I genuinely welcome those types of questions, because to your point, if you've got decision makers who ultimately are our clients, who's they trust us with their spend, and they trust us with their brands, and they trust us with the delivery of that spend in a way that makes them look good and their businesses flourish, we have to be able to answer those questions. So I think what's important is the topic of attention has been around for a while. And as I mentioned earlier, the types of research that have been done on attention have been myriad different findings that have come to light, media ones, creative ones. What needs to be super, super crystal clear is that there is a robust metric that we can apply to every different part of the decisioning journey and the deliverables for our clients. And crucially, that they can translate into the metrics that they typically want to see, and that they track, and that they can prove and deliver internally, or as to show business growth. So in simple terms, one of the reasons we've chosen to partner with Karen and the team at Amplified is because we had the beauty of the academic element. So, Karen herself has done a lot of research in the space and has written many, many books. But behind the research is the testing environment that we ran our experiment through, but extrapolated to the tune of, I think it's 38.4, although she just released a statistic to say there's now about 50. So I'm sure I'll get an email from her soon saying you've got the number wrong. But there's 50 billion or 38, between 38 and 50 billion, I'll come back to you on the exact number, biometric data points that sit within the attention planning system that we have access to. So in simple terms, what that means is we can use that data to augment and complement our modeling. So right from the beginning of the process, we can say, look, this is what your market mix modeling or your media mix modeling is saying. If we factor in the API data we have on attention, so that these 38.4 billion biometric data points across all the different channels, we can show you the predicted uplift with a high degree of certainty for tuning towards certain attention formats and environments versus the set you're currently using. So that's an important start point that I think can give clients some confidence. But again, it still doesn't mean anything until you've run it through the media. So if you move sort of along the planning process, so to speak, if you can visually follow me, when you start thinking about actual channel choice, then you have to be able to lens that MMM data, what's worked before, audience consumption data, what does the audience I'm particularly looking at building a media plan around, what do they consume? And then you add attention data to get to the really granular view of these are the actual formats and environments that are going to work harder for me. And you can do a side-by-side comparison, which we do with most of our clients, to say, if we tuned your media plan towards higher attention environments, these are the relatively micro, actually, like, a couple of percentage points here between one social platform and another, or one set of formats and another. This is the expected uplift in attention. But crucially to the point that this particular client asked on the day in Cannes, also the shift that's expected to the types of outcomes that matter to them. So the impressions delivered, but also the reach gained, and then the points of consideration that we can generate, or whatever that metric might be. But the final part that's possibly the most important is that same data needs to be buyable addressable into media buying environments. So again, with Amplified, it's not just Amplified. Lots of the attention specialist companies have these, but they have deals with the Trade Desk, for example. So you can actually then tune your buy towards those attention environments. So you give clients the confidence that you're modeling the outcome with and without, you're showing the planning choices with and without, and then you're showing that it's being pulled through to the buy. And then you can close the loop and show from a dashboard delivery perspective, and then back into that model, these are the variables that have changed when we've chosen to gear ourselves towards attention or not. So I do feel like that should be a real confidence booster for clients, because you can say, look, at every stage, we can still give you the report on what's happening in the metrics that you know and love, but we can show you the attention realities as they change. And then the final part, I suppose, is just making sure that we're building a bank of case studies, because the proof ultimately is in the pudding. I think we all know philosophically it makes sense. If you're not looking at an ad, then you're not taking it in. But you need to have that bank of evidence that says, well, when we made that adjustment for client A or client B, the improvement to business results was X or Y. So,
And then layering on, I imagine, lots more research because you might not be looking at an ad, but maybe you're listening to an ad.
Yeah.
And that's much harder to quantify because you're not using eye tracking data. I'm actually not sure where the cutting edge is in terms of trying to track attention.
Well, yeah, and you raise a good point. We have a client that we're pitching for again, where you would naturally assume a lot more audio inventory. I won't go into the reasons why,
Sure.
but you naturally would. And it raises a really interesting point because you go, well, does that mean that you can rely on, to go back to our research, the sonic devices become an important or interesting thing to play with, but also how do you track attention, because there's lots of the biometric data is based on eye tracking. But again, within the system that they have at Amplified, for example, they can track volume on, volume off, and various elements. That said, what's nice is most of the partners that we showed the research to have been desperate to kind of join the party. So I'm hoping, who knows, but I'm hoping over the next year or so, we could start to get a few more outings from a research perspective to build an interesting body of knowledge, audio being one. Loads of people saying, well, if you're knowledgeable now about the impact of assets in 2.5 or 1.5 seconds, so the sort of more fragmented, shorter form environments, what does it look like in the longer form environments and how that's shifting, connected TVs and AV mixes and so on. So it's exciting to know that when we put this research out, a lot of entities have been really excited to see whether they can join the gang or the party, whatever you want to call it.
So what's the priority then? If we're having this conversation in a year, what are 2 or 3 key questions that you would love to be able to answer for your clients?
Well, the first one is probably to answer that question that you raised from Can. I just think in order for us to confidently be able to talk about creative and media integration, or talk about how measuring attention as a good proxy for the integration of creative and media, we have to be able to show with a larger body of evidence than current, although it's growing, the ability for that to correlate directly to business impact. So I think, we've got lots of the things in place. We've got case studies that we're building. I think in a year's time, it would be great to almost have a much larger bank of evidence that is sort of harder to push against. And again, I think that's coming. The other thing is, this is very specific. That was a sort of a broader point. The specific one is, I do think the discussion we had about creators is really interesting, because if you think about the landscape in social, the amount of new formats and content types that are being curated and built by these amazing attention wizards, which is like, street interviews and people doing, impromptu dances on TikTok or whatever it might be. Even you look at like the New York Times columnists, they have their own formats and ways of delivering information in TikTok and they're becoming creators in their own right.
Yeah, Jamel Bouie's really big in this space. Yeah.
Exactly. He's amazing. And those guys are continually shaping the expectations of the platform. So if you place standard advertising in between those, increasingly it's going to be seen as a jarring or, sort of experience interrupting thing. So it makes absolute sense to lean into the way that those, the native ways that those content expectations are shifting. But if you cannot say with confidence, this is how we as O2 or Cadbury or whoever own or co-own or distinctively brand alongside that individual, if we choose to work with them, then that is a problem. And I don't think we've got a particularly good answer for it yet. People are asking the questions, but I'm not sure we've got the perfect answer yet.
Widening out as a final question, what would you say is the top challenge that you face as a media strategist today?
I think a lot of the challenges are the translation of strategy into all of the different media environments. If you think about how the landscape is increasingly addressable, if you think about how the buy is increasingly cross-platform, can be optimized in a myriad different ways. We talk about AI. You've got solutions like PMax or Advantage Plus, which are brilliant insofar as they're very democratic. Anybody from a big holding company media agency to an independent like us to, Tim's Media on the corner, that you can log into those platforms and use them. I suppose the challenge is to prove that the strategic work that's done to define a more relevant and valuable audience set, a more relevant and valuable linkage and connective tissue with what the brand is trying to deliver, the assets that we use, and then crucially the environments we deploy in, having that strategy set with brilliant creative media executions baked into it, the risk is, and always has been, but increasingly is going to only get worse if we don't kind of keep a handle on it, is flies in the face of some of these algorithmic buying machines. And there's plenty of ways we can do it, but I do think that's a challenge that is still being faced by strategists. It's just to make sure that your narrative and the point of difference that you've outlined is maintained. It used to be presumably a lot easier when you could say, these are the types of scheduling changes in my linear TV plan I want to see, and that's still occasionally the case. Pushing that into how we manage and control the outcomes from PMAX or something like that is the challenge that I think we've got to square into.
Well, I'm sure catching up with you about it in a few months' time or years, or who knows. I want to continue the conversation further on. But Will, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks so much for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Media Leader podcast. Our executive producer is me, Jack Benjamin. Special thanks to our production partner, Trisonic. You can find all our episodes on the podcast platform of your choice or on our website at uk.themedialeader.com. But do please remember to subscribe to be notified of our next episode. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at The Media Leader to receive daily coverage of all the biggest news stories in media and advertising. From all of us at The Media Leader, I'm Jack Benjamin. See you next time.